Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Jeff Rock, and welcome to another D. Hilton Associates webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about an ever increasingly critical topic, the best practices in supplemental executive retirement plan design in 2023. We have a ton of great information for you, but first, we're going to go through a couple of administrative items. Just want to let you know that this webinar will be recorded, so you will be able to get a recording of this on our website in about 3 to 5 business days. Additionally, we will send out a follow-up email that will contain the slide deck that we're going to go through today. So you will be able to get a copy of that slide deck. If you have any questions through this whole process, please feel free to utilize the Q&A section or the chat section, both of which will come to us. We're going to try to keep this seminar to about 45 to 50 minutes to be able to save some time for questions at the end, but we might be able to get to your questions on the fly. So please don't hesitate to go ahead and ask any questions. We'll be happy to get to those. Additionally, you'll receive a follow-up email that's actually going to have a survey in it as well. Let us know how we're doing, if the topic was on point, if there was anything interesting in there, or if you'd like to see some future topics. That's certainly where we're going to look from there. But without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce, joining me in the studio today is Debbie Hilton. How are you, Debbie?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Also joining us is Brian KIDWELL. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing great. This is a really, really great introduction.
That's what I do, man. I got a lot of practice in this. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay.
So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Debbie. Debbie, I know we want to talk about a little bit, how did this whole process start, and how long have we actually been going through getting this supplemental executive retirement plan information?
We've been working with credit unions to design custom retention and retirement plans for about 30 years. And 20 years ago, we decided that we would introduce the first SERP survey in the industry. And our upcoming survey will soon be released into the industry. We'll be sending it out to credit unions 100 million or greater in assets. And the results will be published probably in the summer.
Fantastic. So you're saying we've been doing this for quite some time, is what
20 plus. We've been doing SERPs for 30 years and the SERP survey for 20 years.
Fantastic.
I would say that also the data that we gather on SERPs, we have the unique way of updating that between surveys. Because executive recruiting is a key D. Hilton core practice going back to day one, every candidate that goes through our process tells us what type of retention and retirement plan they have. So we regularly update the data as that information comes in. And that's in addition to the 400 SERPs we have under management and the other comp practice that you and John administer.
And I think that's a very critical point, is the fact is that we're not just surveying and finding out this information. These are actively being maintained. These are actively being managed, as well as those that we're actually talking to dealing with other services.
Yes.
Fantastic.
I think one thing what we definitely wanted to talk about was a little bit about what is a SERP. I think a lot of people in this audience, we looked at the attendee list, a lot of CEOs, HR folks, board members. So you probably have a general idea what a SERP is, but I guess we can spend a couple of minutes just talking about what a SERP is, and then talk a little bit about probably what you're here for, which is some of what we see in our 2023 forecast data that we're, based on what we're seeing in the industry. Real quickly, SERPs, Supplemental Executive Retention and Retirement Plan. It is what you would call a non-qualified deferred compensation plan. We always say it is discriminatory, and what we mean by that is that it can be offered to anyone at the credit union. It can be completely customized to the individual, which helps strengthen that retention. One of the things that I think we wanted to make sure and talk some about today was one of the things we're seeing we haven't necessarily seen in the past is that these plans are increasingly being used for stronger succession strategy. Mm-hmm. And that's something I think when you look at the forecasts, you're going to see those numbers pushing up, especially in the number twos. And if you've listened to some of our other webinars, if you've looked at some of our research or talked to us, one thing that you'll hear abundantly clear is that there is a massive wave of retirements due to the baby boomers. This is not something that we're seeing change. If anything, it's only going to continue to increase over the next 5 to 6 years. And we're seeing that translating. I know, Jeff, in your practice, in the compensation practice with you and John and the rest of your team, you're seeing those compensation strategies continue to develop and enhance. And we're seeing it the same on our retention retirement practice, where existing clients that have plans are looking to enhance them. Are they looking into put plans in place, not just for the CEO, sometimes not just the number two or the next level down, but even the third level down, just because the amount of turnover in the industry is greater than we've ever seen. Am I missing anything? And is it pretty good little summary of SERPs?
That's a very good summary of SERPs. We have, D. Hilton has experienced record numbers of recruiting. In the last 3 years, we've had record numbers of new clients come into our SERP practice. And I think it's being driven by the number of departures from the industry. So credit unions have really been looking at ways other than just increasing comp, for instance, to retain the best and the brightest, and not looking just at the CEO position any longer, but looking at the C-suite, and then even succession planning at the level below the C-suite. So our last few years have been very busy designing custom SERPs, and we've seen a great deal of change in the way these SERPs are designed and administered.
Yeah. And I think the difficulties, especially with a lot of people that have been retiring and that wave that's going out, it's been exacerbated by the fact of how few good qualified executives we can find quickly to either replace those positions. And then if that happens, okay, now we're talking about a further market rate or even more expensive. So without actually having something in place to retain those quality executives, you're certainly at risk.
Well, to add to that, I know from the recruiter's perspective, and speaking with our professionals in the recruiting practice, we have clients that are increasingly looking for positions out of industry, and I'm not talking just credit union or banks. We've had conversations about SERPs on general counsel, even HR professionals, marketing professionals, obviously technology, a big area that we're seeing a lot of recruitment from out of industry. When you're talking to obviously a CTO, maybe you're talking about someone who might be working at a large place where stock options. But if you're talking to, say, general counsel, you have things like partnership that, and equity that you're dealing with. So we're seeing a lot of that succession thought process go deeper into those positions where it used to just be a CEO or maybe a CEO and a CFO. And that's really changed a lot over even the last couple of years.
And our survey has demonstrated that over the years. I think the key phrase here is peer competitive. When you're hiring a chief technology officer, you've got to look at the peer group. You've got to look at where you're hiring from, where they could be hired away to. So benchmarking SERP design, one size does not fit all. We know that very, very, very well from our recruiting practice. So we recommend custom SERP designs by position, by asset size, and regular reviews. And that's what our SERP survey supports.
I absolutely love the fact that you bring up the whole concept of succession at this point. Most times when I think about a SERP, I'm thinking retention policy, keeping them there. But there's so many times that I have clients that come to me and say, hey, we've got this true number 2, or we've got a number 3 that we really want to demonstrate that we are investing in them and we want them to stay here. A SERP is a great way to really demonstrate that, without just saying, okay, well, here's more salary, here's more salary, here's more salary. We can say, yeah, we have a plan for you. We want you to stay here. And we're saying so much that we want you to stay here. Here's what we're willing to do.
Well, and that's one of the beauties of a SERP plan, is that it can be completely customized, right? So, a good example is you mentioned this number 2 that you have slotted for succession. You might be enhancing that individual person's plan while the rest of the executive team is at a different level in terms of what they're receiving. That's the beauty of these plans. They can be completely customized and they can change. So, we see that all the time where we have a credit union that has a SERP in place for 4 senior executives and calls, says, listen, we've got the notification that our CEO is retiring in 2 years. we don't want to, find ourselves in a situation, a year down the road where we lost that succession. So you can go back and tailor these plans. And I think if you look at the typical SERP plan objectives on slide number 4, you'll see, let's move forward one, obviously to attract, retain, and motivate, as Debbie mentioned, peer competitive. And that's one of the things that we continue to emphasize, and we continue to see some challenges with, and we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the pitfalls that we see. And one of the big ones is that you don't see credit unions sometimes benchmarking on at minimum an annual basis. And what ends up happening is your SERP plan was built in a different time. I mean, so much has changed over the last 3 years. I mean, right? So
when hamburgers were a nickel,
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all of these are relevant. We're not going to spend a lot of time on some of these earlier slides here. The other thing also is retirement plan shortfalls. We're going to show a demonstration of what that means. We are continuing seeing that on the compensation side, as credit unions are continuing to increase compensation more aggressively to be able to be competitive and to reward. We're also seeing those gaps between what qualified plans like 401k matching can do and where the executive is in reality. And so there's just a lot of different factors that are coming into play in making sure these plans stay competitive. This is our 21-22 SERP methodology. We're not going to spend a lot of time on talking about the methodology. You can see the response rate by credit union. I know what we really want to get to is talking a little bit about our SERP forecast for 2023. And you can see these are SERP plans among CEOs. You can see from 100 million on the left all the way up to 1 billion plus. And one of the things you're going to notice is that purple bar, and that's our estimate of where we think SERP plans are going to be in 2023. Obviously, once we send out our 2023 SERP survey, we're going to send out that for people to respond next month in March. We're hoping to have data, as Debbie said, by the end of summer. But we're thinking that this is probably going to trim pretty closely based on what we're seeing in our recruiting practice, as well as our compensation and SERP practice. And one thing where you can see these purple arrows, what we really anticipate seeing is a lot of growth in SERP plans among CEOs between 200 million and $1 billion. Obviously, in the billion plus category, we were at 84% in our most recent survey. We're probably not, I mean, there's only so much you can get in terms of percentage of usage. So we're probably going to see that on the billion plus pretty stable. Obviously, when you look at the higher asset categories, the higher you look, if you look 5 billion plus, you're going to see that percentage tend to creep higher. But you can obviously see among billion-dollar credit and SERPs are very prominent with CEOs. Where we see a lot of growth is in these 200 to a billion categories. And I think a lot of it is,
and that's where people are recruiting.
This is where people are recruiting.
People are recruiting. The one thing I will add is that our next survey, we will be addressing 5 billion and above. We've done a lot of recruiting in that area. We do a predominant amount of compensation work in that area, and we're going to include categories, a category above $1 billion. The other thing I think that kind of goes hand in hand with this is that when you're designing a SERP, you want to design a SERP and put it in place with the idea that you want to retain your executive as your organization grows. So you may be 200 million today, but the SERP you design should perhaps be more in line with what you see in the 400 to 600 million, because that's where you're going to be in 5 years, right? So you want to look one asset category ahead and not necessarily just where you are today in terms of SERP design. So CEO SERPs have absolutely increased since I started working on this 30 years ago. These are extraordinarily high percentage of credit unions do use these plans in order to compete against other financial institutions.
Yeah, both internally and externally, because the competition is not just credit unions.
No.
For the most part, yeah, your CEO, if they're probably going to go one rank above, kind of like what you're talking about there. I think that's a great point. Designing that supplemental executive retirement plan to defend against that next tier up, because one, you're going to be there, and two, that's most likely your competition for
Correct.
that executive.
Yeah, that's where they're going to hire from.
Let's look at non-CEOs. This is an area where we have seen a substantial,
Tremendous amount of increase in development.
yeah, and so you can see our forecasts for 2023. And one thing you'll notice is that you see a large spike in the 600 million plus category. Obviously, there's need in some of the lower asset categories, but as you continue to grow in assets, you obviously have more resources to devote to retention. And one thing that I know that we're seeing across the board is in our larger asset categories, retaining those non-CEO executives is a huge priority.
And the other thing I think, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is that the larger the organization, the more impact the IRS caps are going to have on 401k plans. So the larger the organization, the more employees you're going to have that are not able to participate fully in a 401k plan. So that's called a 415 limit, an IRS 415 limit. So that's an important reason to evaluate shortfalls in the C-suite in order to bring parity to where other employees are. I know there's a question here. Any
Yeah.
sense for percentage of CEOs with SERPs 20 years ago? Yeah, I can tell you that. It was about 40%.
Yeah.
About, 20 years ago, 40% of CEOs.
So we talked a little bit about, I think this goes to the idea that SERPs are, 20 years ago, you didn't see these in the number 2 positions nearly as often. If you look today at non-CEO executives, and this, we break this out and we continue to see this going higher. For example, your Peach is CFO. So you see predominantly across the asset categories, if you're going to do a SERP for someone other than CEO, it is typically a CFO executive, but you're also seeing even in the top lending executive, which is a huge driver, obviously, of income, your top operations executive. And then you'll see even in those positions like top IT executive, especially when you're in the $1 billion plus category, become substantially higher. And we have seen this continued increase. This is one area that I think when we see data from our 2023 survey, I think across the board, we're going to see significant increases based on what we're just seeing in the industry.
And there's huge difference now versus 20 years ago. I mean, 20 years ago, credit unions wanted to hire promote internally. And now there's a much greater acceptance that in order to get the best and brightest in these areas, credit unions are willing to go external. And in order to attract those people, you have to come up with comp packages that are competitive with the for-profit world. So I think that makes a big difference. We know from our executive recruiting practice that these external, if you're hiring people into these C-suite spots, that it's not just CEOs that are asking for a SERP when you negotiate an offer. Increasingly, a SERP is on the table for C-suite executives at hire.
I think it speaks volumes to how many people are actually viable for a SERP nowadays that we have to use peach as a color, Brian. We've gone through the rainbow on this one.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a good comment. I hadn't really noticed that until you mentioned. Maybe in our 23 survey, we will mix up the colors for everyone. I see we have another question. This is really a great question. We get this a lot from boards. Debbie, you want to?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Lionel. Who makes the decision to add on a non-CEO SERP? And I think that is a great question for a couple of reasons. I would say that it typically is a recommendation that is made by the board. By the CEO. The CEO makes that recommendation typically because they may see a need to put a SERP in place to retain a person and or to recruit for that position. However, our policy or what we consider to be best policy is for the board to be involved in the approval of a SERP for other C-suite executives. So we feel like it's it initiates with the CEO, but the board should be involved and understand why that executive is being slated
Mhm.
for that CEO or that SERP.
One of this is a great question, and Debbie and I've ran into this a lot.
We can.
What you typically will hear from a board member, you started talking about non-CEOs, so they'll say that's not my business. I have one employee. I don't tell them what to do. We have this governance model. We have one employee. But the reason that it's important that the board is involved with this is we've seen recruiting jobs
Mhm.
where the entire C-suite, with the exception of the CEO, leaves. And the board says, what's going, what's
Mhm.
happening?
Why the turnover?
And why the turnover? And it's because the organization was not implementing these plans. And so we'll get this sometimes from the recruiting perspective from boards. And we're not saying you need to make every decision, for the entire organization. But the issue is, if the CEO leaves abruptly, at the end of the day, the board is responsible for making sure that the members are getting taken care of, that the credit unions, taken care of, and all of that. And that's why having that some involvement is important.
And we've got some great policy templates that we could share with anyone who's interested in kind of how that works in terms of recommending a non-CEO for a SERP, how it gets to the board, and what the board needs to approve. And I think it's important that it be a discussion point with the board and the CEO annually, but especially as the CEO gets closer to retirement age.
Yeah, I
From
think this
succession planning, the board should know who else is vulnerable to leaving.
and it's also important. It also gets the board involved in more than knowing just the CEO, because the
Mhm.
CEO leaves. Okay, we have internal candidates, and the board goes, "Who are you?" They
Yes.
haven't been involved, invested. They know, oh yeah, you joined back when you were a teller, and we loved you back then. You've made it all the way to the C-suite, but that's all they know them as, is somebody that was a teller. So these plans kind of force the board to actually acknowledge and understand a little bit more about the executives that are below there.
That's a great point. And as Debbie said this many times, and it always, I think, rings true, that these SERP plans are investments in your
HR.
talent. And I think, to your point, Jeff, that's a great reminder that the boards are getting to know the executive. They're also understanding what value they're bringing to the organization, because I mean, Debbie has said many a times, just like you build a branch and you assess, is it the cost of it? Is it worth it? These are no different.
Yeah, you need to do a cost evaluation, risk evaluation. So we've got a couple of other questions here. We'll go ahead and put in there. How to design a SERP for an executive already in their 60s, but the organization wants the executive to stay on. We do that all the time. We've spent a lot of time. I think we've probably done more of that in the last 3 years than we've ever done. It's a case by case approach is what we use. And there's a lot of different ways of doing it. And a lot of boards see a really important reason for keeping that CEO longer. And so I would say it's absolutely doable, but let's be creative about it. It's not one size fits all for sure. What percentage of SERP plans utilize pre-funding plans? We'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. I think we'll get to more of that. And then what is the typical size of a SERP for CEOs and others? We're going to get to that as well. Once again, a SERP for a 40-year-old is going to be a very different SERP design than it would be for a 60-year-old. I would also say a SERP for a marketing professional is going to be a very different SERP than it would be for a CEO. A SERP for a credit union executive that's $1 billion in assets is going to be a very different SERP than it would be for an executive at a $5 billion organization. So all of those different questions and design elements and assumptions need to be customized for each client.
Mhm.
And that is our approach to handle it in that
I
way.
think to oversimplify it, I think you put it perfectly. One size does not fit all.
Well, we know that. We know that, Jeff, because recruiting, from an executive recruiting perspective, we have many, many candidates that have SERPs.
Mhm.
And when they apply for an opportunity here, they share with us their comp data, they share with us their retention data, and they have SERPs, but they're still looking, right? We can do a lot. We can do a lot to stop that
Mhm.
with regular reviews.
There you go.
Okay.
Now, if we move forward, this kind of gets to the question of size. I mean, as Debbie said, all SERP plans are unique to the individual. One way that oftentimes you benchmark the SERP plan is based on target percentage of total compensation. And when we say total compensation, we're talking about base salary and variable pay.
Cash compensation.
Cash compensation. So you can see at the 50th percentile, that's the median, right? So half credit unions are higher, half credit unions lower. You can see that for 2023, the median percentage target is 70% of final. It's typically final average compensation, either the last 3 years or last 5 years.
And it's pre-tax. That's a pre-tax percentage. And it typically includes Social Security benefit and the 401k and or any pension that the executive receives.
One thing that we're likely to see is especially in the larger percentiles, we're anticipating we're probably going to see target percentages moving northward, north of 80 to 85%. You can see our forecast right now is at the 95th, moving to 85%. We could see that 85% even dip into the 90th percentile. We are seeing a lot of credit unions revising their target percentages upward. And this kind of goes to this person's question around typical size. You know, in many cases, a $500 million and a $1 billion credit union might be targeting the same 75%. The big difference is the compensation is different, right?
And the SERP amount would be different.
The SERP amount would be different because the compensation, we're solving for a larger compensation in retirement.
And then the question that somebody asked about, how do you incent a 60-year-old CEO to stay beyond age 60? One of the things that we've seen is a creative use of adding additional SERP distributions with a higher percentage target in order to stay for those extra years as incentive. Need to be creative in the carrots, right?
Yep.
Creative in the carrots. Yeah, the carrots that you put out there. We do know that as there's been incredible turnover at the CEO level, we've also seen incredible turnover in non-CEOs, that's C-suite. And what credit unions have realized is they're very vulnerable here. And you may have 3 internal candidates and they all 3 can't get the CEO job.
Mhm.
So how do you keep your team together? And the larger the organization, typically the larger the team. And so credit unions have really embraced the idea of SERP plans, retention and retirement plans for other executives, non-CEO executives, especially those that are most valuable to the team that you can't afford to lose, would be very hard to replace. And that target percentage of final average total comp has gone up. It's definitely gone up to like the 65 to 70% range. It depends upon the position. It depends very much on how hard it would be to replace that executive. So we've done a lot of work in this area with credit unions that have maybe had SERP plans in place for us at the CEO level for a lot of years. And now they've come back to us and said, okay, we need to make sure that we add SERPs to the mix for executives now that are at other levels. And even not at just the C-suite level, you can be creative in finding ways to retain executives at the VP level.
Mhm.
So we can do that. We've done all of that.
One of the nice things when you're talking about target percentages is target percentages allow the SERP to grow with the executive and grow with the credit union. And
It can.
it can.
Yeah.
And
That's
so
best practice.
that is best practice. And so that's why when you oftentimes, when we kind of talk about pitfalls, you might see a plan that just has a fixed dollar amount of $1 million, right? After 20 years. And at the time, maybe when you put it together 15 years ago, 20 years ago, $1 million was
Pre 2008.
right, was really good, right?
Yeah.
But then once you start actually looking at what you're losing because you can't contribute in the qualified plan, the credit union can't put money aside in the matching program. You take a look at what's going on in the industry and think about it. If you design the plan when you're $300 million and 15 years later, you're $1.5 billion, that is a very different organization. The compensation is significantly higher. And that's one of the things that we do like about target percentage strategies is that they do allow as the organization grows, as the compensation grows, to compensate the executives properly.
Yeah, that carrot didn't turn into a baby carrot is what you're going for.
So those little mini carrots. So what I would say is going back to the way I used to design SERPs, and we put SERPs in place pre-2008, the Great Recession. SERPs were very much set up as defined contribution, where you were solving for a fixed dollar amount at X date and typically at retirement. After 2008, we saw a shift in compensation philosophy, a greater emphasis on pay for performance, a greater emphasis from base pay to total cash compensation using a combination of base and a variable pay program, usually based upon a scorecard. And having a SERP that is more defined benefit in design, where that defined benefit is tied to the executive's performance, ensures that the executive is going to be paid what they're worth, and based upon peer size and based upon their promotion, where they are in the organization. The SERP, we think the best practice is to have a SERP that keeps up with the executive's performance throughout their career. I see we have a couple of questions here. And one of the questions is the SERP target, the total comp over the length of the SERP. Yes, it is the total comp target. What we're talking about when we talk about 70%, that would be over their career and at retirement age, normal retirement age. So normal retirement age for most executives today is going to be like age 67, because that's when they're fully eligible for Social Security. The typical SERP that has the greatest retention is a SERP that has multiple distributions over that career as well. And when you talk about other senior executives, one of you asked about what is other senior executives. It's any senior executive, outside of the CEO that's what we would refer to. But I think what you're talking about is the chart where we listed these.
The senior execs.
It has to do with the way that the titles have shifted over time. And, now, for instance, the top HR executive might be called the top people, the top strategy officer or top people's people. So that's kind of the catch-all. It could be, and just an EVP title. So that's the catch-all. I hope that answered that question. And then, do you typically see payouts at normal retirement date at earlier intervals? Both. The best SERP as a retention tool is going to be a SERP that has multiple distributions throughout a career. If you tell a 40-year-old, once again, that they have to wait till age 67 to get a SERP distribution, they're going to thumb their nose at their thumb at you, right? Or
thumb their nose at
you.
Exactly.
They're
going to do something.
They're going to do something you don't like.
To take a call from a recruiter. So, I say spread it out and, but do it strategically so that the credit union's overall succession plan taken into consideration all the executives
Yeah.
and the CEO's retirement is what should be looked at. That's the way we approach a project.
And you tie those to life events, right? Or you can
You
tie those to
can.
life events.
You tie it, I think, to strategic milestones in their career.
Mm.
So let's say you may hire a new chief technology officer and they ask for a SERP as part of their offer. Yeah, you can give them a SERP. You know, you can agree to that, but you don't necessarily give them a SERP distribution in year 2. You set it out to where maybe it's on their 5th anniversary, or you know, look at strategic milestones in a career.
Well,
Make sure it
and
matches.
you don't want everybody getting a SERP payment on the same year.
Oh,
No.
yeah.
Because then you risk every
Year 5, everybody's getting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If an executive has a SERP and another executive on the same tier or level does not have a SERP, does this present a concern, or could it present a concern? Absolutely. I mean, you know, I think that one of the things that needs to be taken into consideration is that you do not pay every executive or every employee in your organization at the same level. And so SERPs are discriminatory for a reason. You want to retain and motivate those executives that would be the hardest to replace. So it comes down to I think a question: does the executive bring more value to the table than what the SERP costs? And so you do not need to design. In fact, it's rare that we see every executive get the same thing. And I think that confidentiality is incredibly important. We do not recommend that credit unions have a comp philosophy that says when you get to be a chief, you get a SERP. That is not it's not a rite of passage.
Mhm.
It should be selective and discriminatory, and it should be carefully considered and approved on a case-by-case basis.
So do you want to talk a little bit about
Sure.
CEO plan types?
Yeah. So, you know, there's a zillion different ways of doing this, and we've done about a zillion. I mean, I don't even know how many thousands of SERPs we've designed over the years. And we have about 400 SERPs under management. And you guys, everybody on this call is familiar with probably split dollar. You're familiar with 457F plans. 457F is an IRS code that applies to not-for-profits. If you're a hospital, you have a not-for-profit hospital. Or if you're a university, you have a 457F plan. The 457F plan is a credit union controlled plan. The credit union has control over the plan, and 457Fs are far more flexible in design elements than an insurance-based or collateral assignment plan. A collateral assignment or an insurance-based plan tends to be more of an executive-owned, an executive-directed plan. And what we have found, and we asked this question in our survey, but we also ask the question of every candidate that goes through our recruiting process. 457F SERPs are far more retentive than the insurance or executive owned SERPs. They're more retentive because of the flexibility in design, and they can be tied more easily to the executive's performance. So the larger the credit union is in asset size, the more likely they are to have a plan with greater flexibility, with greater numbers of distributions, and with a defined benefit approach. Collateral assignment split dollar plans are defined contribution plans. And They may appear to be more cost effective. I think that's kind of a selling point, or what you're sometimes told. But if the credit union, if the executive's value is greater than what that collateral assignment is promising based upon insurance performance, then the retention piece goes down. So the 457F approach is still the predominant design approach that we see from our SERP survey, from our design approach, and from what the candidates tell us.
And you do start to see some hybrid plans.
Yeah, and we do hybrid plans.
Yeah.
Where there's a combination of both. If you currently have a collateral assignment split dollar plan, then there isn't any reason why we can't do an evaluation and perhaps enhance that plan design by putting an overlay of a 457 on top of it. We do that all the time. The number one reason for offering a SERP plan for many, many years now is retention, 94%. And that number, I think, is consistent. Also, restoration of qualified plan shortfalls. So for 2023, the IRS cap is $330,000. And that means that any executive that makes more than $330,000 in cash compensation, base and variable pay, that is the maximum amount of comp that they are going to receive a 401k match and or contribution from their employer. So you may have a very generous 401k matching program, and a lot of credit unions do. But it's a rare situation when a CEO or a top C-suite executive is able to fully participate because of the income caps. So the SERP is certainly one way to restore that shortfall and bring parity to those highly comped executives. So we are often called and asked to evaluate SERPs that were put in place a number of years ago. And we spend a lot of time doing forensic work, for want of a better word, looking at what the executive team has, what the original intent was when they put it in place, and how it stacks up to peers today. Mm-hmm. So we basically look at everything, come back to the credit union, and makes very specific recommendations about what they can do to strengthen their retention approach and enhance succession planning. These are some of the things we've seen recently. What can go wrong with SERP design and effectiveness? Assumptions used in the original design. So if you've assumed, for instance, that your executive was going to get a 3% raise and a 10% bonus, because that's where they were when the SERP was put in place, and they've averaged 6% raises, and your bonus structure allows them to get 2 or 3 times that, then that SERP target is probably out of date and needs adjusting. It may not be substantive enough to keep them focused. The SERP documentation is out of compliance. We see this all the time and not in sync with other documentation. It's shocking to me always. Employment contracts are typically governed by state employment laws. SERP contracts, split dollar contracts, come under federal law. But very, very frequently, we see a misalignment and use of different definitions of, for instance, a termination for cause. So you've got documentation that may be out of sync, and where you're terminating an executive under an employment contract, but that termination isn't triggered in a SERP. Mm-hmm. You may see a misalignment or synchronicity in terms. So we really, one of the things we always ask is, let me see all the documents and let's make sure they're in compliance. We see a lot of change in retention and retirement plans. As somebody asked earlier, executives may rethink their retirement, and boards may rethink how long they want to keep an executive. So yeah, you can go back and redo these. And there really isn't any rule why you can't have more than one SERP. You can have more than one. The other thing is that when an executive is promoted from maybe a chief level to a CEO level, then that too is a time to evaluate, is this peer competitive now that this promotion has occurred? If you've got an executive team that's been promoted, even let's just say you had a VP of human resources and now they're a chief people officer, that's a good time to evaluate whether or not maybe the SERP, maybe a SERP wasn't appropriate at the VP level, but moving into that chief role, that should be perhaps considered. What we also see is, and we spend a lot of time addressing, is executives don't understand the benefit of their SERP. So we ask executives when they apply for a job, okay, well, so tell me about your SERP. And they're like, well, I have one. What's it worth? Well, I don't really know. I think credit unions don't necessarily do a very good job of sharing. Yeah, they need to articulate every single year what that SERP is worth to that executive. Our approach is to meet annually with the board and the credit union, but also to meet annually with each executive as participants so that they understand what they have and appreciate it. So the communication after the plan design is put in place tends to fall off, and it's on a shelf, in other words. Benchmarking against peers, incredibly important, and we don't see enough of that. We think a lot of times that credit unions assume that they put a SERP in place and that it's going to be sufficient going forward. But how do you know that? How do you know that it's sufficient unless you go through an exercise where you benchmark and evaluate, kind of like the same exercise you did when you first put it in place? And so using a third party to do that and doing it on a regular basis is the best way to make sure that your time and energy originally put it into place is there. When I first started, when D. Hilton first started with SERPs, we used to spend a lot of time helping credit unions recruit executives, and then we would spend a lot of time doing executive comp, and then the SERP would be handled somewhere else. And then we'd be getting resumes from the executives that we helped put these comp packages in place. And it was like, that's when we decided to bring it all in-house and offer consulting and executive recruiting, executive comp, and SERP design, so that if you go out of your way to hire the best and brightest and you pay them what you should, that you also have this third piece that keeps them there.
No, it gives you the opportunity to make sure that both hands know what the other hand is doing as well.
Exactly.
I think invariably it comes down to, it's not the Ron Popeil methodology. You cannot set it and forget it. You have to go back to continuously looking at it. You think annually seems to be a good kind of trigger to look at this thing then?
Annually is our approach. The IRS does not mandate regular reviews of these, but if you look at the number one reason, which is retention, over and over and over, 94%, it's about retention, then you look at compensation annually, you should look at this piece annually as well.
Absolutely.
I think we got a couple of more minutes here. I
Okay.
put up, I think you kind of hit on a lot of these about, the SERPs being aligned with executive performance. and in terms of that, we talked about the different designs, future promotions, things of that nature. And I thought you had an interesting question here, which is what if the executive isn't performing?
So I think that's a great question. And the problem with a defined contribution approach, where you promise an executive an amount in the future, and they get that amount, and it's based upon typically performance of an investment or an insurance contract. We're going to give you $1 million, Jeff Rock, in 5 years.
You heard it. I got it recorded.
Yeah. The problem is that you end up, or you can end up, paying an underperformer that $1 million and underpaying a high performer for the value they bring to the table. And that was the reason in 2008, during the Great Recession, we really saw a significant shift to pay for performance. So having a pay for performance compensation philosophy in general, base, variable, and SERP, and having them all aligned ensures that you'll be able to tell your members that the people that are getting payouts are getting them because they bring great value to the organization.
Is that return on investment?
It's return on the investment.
Absolutely.
And that's what this is. So if an executive gets a SERP distribution, they get a SERP distribution that's proportionate with what they bring to the table and not tied to their pulse rate.
I like that methodology very much.
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent of pay for performance on almost
But
all
I did not mean that you're getting $1 million in 5 years. Sorry.
We're going to scratch that part of it. We'll go
Yeah,
back to the
right.
other. It's recorded.
So
Yeah.
I think in terms of wrapping up, I mean, these are some of the areas that we've talked about. We often share this slide with our clients, talking about that need for ongoing education, continuing to emphasize it. One of the things we talked about today was succession playing a much larger part of SERP plan design. Obviously, in onboarding, when you're onboarding new board members, this is an area where when we have new board
Yes.
members come on, we need to take typically a couple of hours to kind of talk to them about some of the mechanics of SERPs and things of that nature. And that's something that credit unions are really going to need to think about. We have seen a lot of board turnover, just like we've seen turnover in management, and making sure that board members understand the comp philosophy. They understand why this was put in place, how it works is important. Frequent plan reviews, third-party validation, and executive reviews, making sure the executives understand the value of what they have in place is just another way to enhance retention.
I think a lot of my clients, even some that I know that are on this call, would agree that it's one thing for me to sit down and do a review with the board of directors, but for me to be in a conference room where any of the executives that have a SERP can come in during the day and talk to me about their SERP, ask me questions about their SERP, refreshers on their SERP, is incredibly valuable. It reminds them why they're important to the organization.
I mean, communication is going to be the key in all of this. I mean, even in my area, it's that whole concept of when people think they're being undercompensated, they're more likely to leave. If they don't fully understand the value of that SERP that they have in place, if you're not communicating that on a day-to-day basis or giving them an opportunity to really discuss what's involved in that, that's a big missed opportunity.
Yeah. What we see is SERP design, the SERP design process, the SERP review process is typically handled at a committee level from a board side. But to Brian's point, we do think every few years, the entire board should have a SERP 101 type of meeting so that board members that are not involved on the compensation committee or at the executive level can also understand the importance of why these programs are in place.
Fantastic. All right. Brian, did you want to talk a little bit about, we're going to be going to the GAC.
Oh, yeah. So we'll be at the GAC. Our booth is 325. So please stop by and see us.
We're not giving anything away, but
maybe a pen or two.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, come by.
Yeah, we
anyway.
have highlighters, I think.
We got
Yeah,
some
we have
highlighters,
plenty.
some
We
hand
Hand
sanitizer.
Hand sanitizer, yeah.
Exactly.
Tried and true methodology there.
Yeah,
I like it.
exactly.
So by all means, if you have any questions that we were not able to get to through this presentation, please stop by. Brian and Debbie would certainly like to be able to chat with you about certain things along that line. But again, just to wrap this up, we did record this webinar. So if you missed anything or if you're unable to join at the very beginning, it will be posted on our website in about 3 to 5 business days. You will also receive an email follow-up with this presentation in the email. So you will actually have the slide deck that we went through. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Debbie, thank you so much for joining us. I really do sincerely appreciate you taking the time. It was fantastic to hear all about this.
That was probably because I promised you that $1 million.
We're going to go back to that. We're going to check the tapes on that one. Brian, thank you so much as well
Thank
for
you.
taking the time. We do sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you.
And happy National Margarita Day.
And we're going to go visit the Margarita Day. Thank you guys so
Yeah.
much for joining. We do appreciate it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.